Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining. We're just gonna get started here in a few minutes. Okay, thank you everyone so much for joining today's webinar. We're gonna go ahead and get started. My name is Catherine. I'm one of our team's organic consultants based in Pennsylvania, and I'm joined with my teammates, Leah Varik and Nick Bodal, who you'll hear from a little later. And today we're gonna be talking about building soil organic matter in organic grain systems. Just a quick note on housekeeping as we get started. We'll ask that you put all of your questions in the Q&A box, since we won't really be monitoring the chat too closely. And Leah is going to be helping monitor those questions, so feel free to jump in, Leah, and we can also save some until the end. If you can't hear, just check your audio settings. There's also a contact number here for Justin, who's helping monitor our webinar if you need to reach out to someone for technical help. All right, so what are we going to be talking about today? So first and foremost, we'll be covering what is soil organic matter. So defining it and discussing its benefits. Secondly, we're going to discuss different ways that we can manage and build soil organic matter on our farms. And then lastly, we're going to spend some time looking at different farmer testimonials to look at different strategies on organic grain farms specifically. Okay, so part one, what is soil organic matter? Firstly, why do we care so much about soil organic matter, and why should we build it? And really, to start thinking about this question, I wanted to start by reading this quote from Naeem Kalwar. So he writes, "Organic matter is linked to important functions in the soil and is critical to maximizing biological activity within the soil. Along with clay particles, it provides cation exchange sites in soils, reducing nutrient leaching losses. Microorganisms using organic matter as a food source promote aggregation of soil particles, resulting in improved structure, soil water infiltration, and holding capacity. It reduces the potential for runoff and erosion as well. Higher organic matter levels also result in favorable soil temperatures, improved plant root growth, healthy microbial populations, and moderate pH ranges." So we'll discuss some of these benefits in more detail, but definitely a takeaway is that soil organic matter is one of, if not the foundation for soil functioning and soil fertility. So adding organic matter results in many beneficial changes to your soil, and we can start to think about those changes as biological, physical, and chemical. So if we look at the figure on the right here, And starting with adding residues, that will break down and firstly start to increase your biological activity. And that's because, let me just turn on the laser pointer here. That's because microorganisms in your soil are eating this organic matter. So that's helping really decompose the residues you're adding. And microorganisms are also helping really make the nutrients that are bound up in that organic matter available to plants. From a physical perspective, we want to think about how organic matter can increase your soil's aggregation. So those crumbs in your soil are really stuck and held together by organic matter. And that's helping maintain aggregates and pore spaces. You know, a healthy soil's approximately 50%, pore space. And that really helps with drainage through macropores and also storage of water in your micropores. And you'll see the word humus here, and that signals are assigned to think about chemical change that we see with organic matter additions. Humus is basically a very stable form of organic matter that's negatively charged. So that's helping to hold on to positively charged ions like calcium, potassium, magnesium, and it's keeping those nutrients from leaching. And instead, it's making them available to plants. This is known as your soil's cation exchange capacity, or CEC. So all these benefits are ultimately supporting healthy plants. And that's why we care so much about building organic matters to support our crops. So we have a sense of some of the benefits of adding organic matter, but what actually is it and why are we adding it to our soils? I like to start with this broad definition of soil organic matter being the totality of organic material, living and non-living, present in your soils. Organic matter, you can also think of being as about half carbon. So you may often hear people talking about soil organic carbon, which is oftentimes what's actually measured in the soil. And then we use a conversion factor based on the assumption that soil organic matter is contained of, 50 to 58% carbon to calculate our soil organic matter levels. And another way to think about what soil organic matter is, which I really like this model used in Building Soils for Better Crops by Fred Magdoff and Harold Van Ness, is to think about it in different pools. So they categorize the living, the dead, and the very dead. The living meaning living organisms in the soil. So really any organism from the smallest of protozoa that's doing a little dance here to the earthworms that you can see and other macroorganisms that you don't really need a microscope to detect, excuse me. The dead refers more to fresh and partially decomposed residues. So any type of, picture winter-killed oats, leaving a residue in your fields, or any type of manure. And the dead also refers to any recently deceased microorganisms. So dead microbial biomass. And that's important because we want to remember that all soil organic matter is constantly being transformed by microorganisms. And the very dead, we'll get a little bit more into. You might hear this referred to as humus, as I mentioned, or more recently referred to as mineral-associated organic matter. So this portion of your soil organic matter is largely made of microbial products that are richer in nitrogen, and they also persist in soils because of chemical bonding to materials and also physical protection within your soil aggregates. So all of these types of organic matter are playing a really important role in helping produce high yields and support healthy crops. So knowing that there are different types of organic matter, we know that not all organic matter is created equally. So you can think of this total pool of organic matter being made up of three types. your active and slow and passive soil organic matter. And this is a conceptualization of a type of first order decay model that was used by scientists in the 90s. And the years here are referring to different mean resistance times, mean residence times. And that's just showing that there are different lengths of time that organic carbon is remaining in these pools. So the first pool here, your active carbon, is turning over really quickly, and it's rapidly being decomposed by soil microbes. And it's a relatively small fraction of your total soil organic matter, but it's really important to crop nutrition since it's breaking down this residue quickly and making available nutrients for your plants. This you may hear also referred to as particulate organic matter. This is mostly, again, young additions of residue, predominantly of plant origin, and it's important for stabilizing aggregates and making nutrients available for plant uptake. The slower pool, it's slightly less rapidly cycled. It's more stable by having a physical protection of the nutrients in this pool. And again, it's also organic matter that microbes are mineralizing, or again, making plant available nutrients. And together, these pools are representing about 20 to 40% of soil organic matter that's turning over really quickly. The biggest portion, or your passive pool, is the very stable organic material, or humus, again referred to as mineral-associated organic matter in more recent frameworks. This is very slow decomposition because it's persisting in soils through chemical bonding to minerals and still some extent of physical protection in small aggregates. And as I mentioned, you might hear some different terminology to refer to different types of organic matter, which I won't go into too much depth on, but I do want to point out that it's highlighting a shift from those traditional models of different pools that are based on varying chemical persistence and mean residence times in favor for models that are more explicitly accounting for the activity of soil microbial communities. So I'll read here, more recently, it's become recognized that simple, readily decomposable molecules are found within even the oldest soil organic carbon fractions. So we can see on this figure on the right here that historically the way soils were extracted, it was changing the nature of the organic substances. It was in fact creating this new substance that we commonly refer to as humic macromolecules, or humus. And because of this extraction method, we thought there were these long-lasting stable compounds that organisms wouldn't consume, We call them recalcitrant. You might have heard that word before, but we're changing to this emerging understanding where we're now able to directly observe organic matter in the soil. And it's showing us that there are simple molecules that exist and that they can be protected by soil's physical and chemical properties. I do want to call out, however, despite this emerging understanding, it does remain unclear whether physical protection alone can fully explain the long persistence of soil organic carbon in slow cycling pools. And we haven't completely adapted this emerging view in our global models of research. But going back to the very dead, or that passive and very stable organic pool, this has sort of earned its nickname because it's behaving in that it's very dead, in that it's inaccessible to organisms. However, part of that shift in thinking is that organic matter in soils is stored through that physical protection over chemical protection, is because soil organic microorganisms can degrade any soil organic matter, regardless of its chemical structure, when they can access it. So this physical protection concept is sort of demonstrated in this figure here, which is a figure of a macromolecule. And you can see it has some plant and fungal debris within it, some clay microstructures, mycorrhizal hyphae running through the pores. And highlighted here in this box is organomineral associations. So that's referring to the organic matter that's stored inside these microaggregates by adsorption to the surfaces and some blockage within the aggregate. So this is all to say the science is always evolving. We're constantly looking for the truth. And I did, again, want to highlight what we understood then versus what we're starting to understand now about this physical protection concept. We do kind of have to be somewhat uncomfortable with not knowing everything, but, forge on with what we do know. And so now that we know about organic matter and how it's stored, I want to move into the second piece of this webinar, which is how do we build it? So there is, the first point I want to make is about adding different types of soil organic matter. And there is a little bit of a dilemma here as we simultaneously need to build organic matter, but it also needs to be decomposed by microorganisms that are then releasing nutrients. So it's a bit of a balancing act, and we really want to highlight that it's highly important to add a variety of residues to provide food for different microbial populations, but also because different residues are having varying effects on the soil organic matter. So if we look at this figure on the right here, we can see different types are having those different effects. So materials with more cellulose, like cover crops when they're still green, they'll decompose more rapidly and have, in some cases, a shorter term effect on soil organic matter compared to residues that, are higher in lignin and are harder to break down, like your corn stalks or, wheat straw. And these residues that are easier to break down typically result in higher levels of plant nutrients, where whereas the harder to break down materials are used to build up your organic matter over time. So looking at this in a bit more detail, the ratio of a residue's carbon to nitrogen, also influences nutrient availability and the rate of decomposition. So as organisms decompose, they're using carbon as a source of energy and nitrogen to produce protein. So on average, microorganisms require around 20 to 30 parts of carbon for every part of nitrogen they consume. So once the carbon to nitrogen ratio of your organic matter starts to exceed 30, you're going to see slower decomposition. And these higher C to N ratios, they can also result in immobilization, meaning the nitrogen in that residue can be tied up since it's harder for the microorganisms to break it down. So these are your highly lignified materials like straw and corn stalks, for example. On the flip side, if your carbon to nitrogen ratio is less than 20, it's easier for microbes to decompose that organic matter. So that means more nitrogen is going to be released into the soil for more immediate use, or what we refer to as mineralized. These are, organic examples like clovers, grasses that are still in their vegetative state. So again, adding different types of residues of these organic amendments is really important, as some are going to be slower to break down than others, while some will also make nutrients available more quickly. And a goal to keep in mind is thinking about adding materials with a high enough carbon to nitrogen ratio without compromising the ability to extract nitrogen for plant uptake. So building an organic matter management plan, I wanted to take a step back, sort of look at how organic matters vary widely across the US. So first, we want to spend time thinking about what we were dealt and what we can't control, and then think about the factors that we can control more through management. So, firstly, taking a look at this map, this is an outcome of a project from the NRCS. It's called the Rapid Carbon Assessment, RACA, and it's showing soil organic carbon stocks in the US that was prepared from hundreds of thousands of soil samples that were modeled, and these samples were all collected in the top meter of the soil, reported in megagrams per hectare. So what you're seeing here with the redder the site is the lower amount of organic carbon, and the bluer is the higher amount of carbon stored. Remembering that we can kind of roughly double the amount of soil organic carbon to get a sense of your soil organic matter level. So if you think about your starting point, say you're starting with very depleted soils somewhere in the mountainous west, your organic matter can actually be more, can be increased faster if you're to change your management practice, because it's already so depleted. Whereas in the prairie soils or mullah soils, you may hear them referred to in the Great Plains and the Corn Belt, these soils still typically have more organic matter despite 100+ years of intensive agriculture. Soil texture is another factor that you can't change. So your fine textured or clay soils, they typically have higher organic matter levels than your sandy or coarse textured soils. And on average, it's easier to maintain the organic matter in those clay soils because of the chemical bonds that stabilize organic compounds. And of course, your climate, so depending where you are in the US, is going to impact your organic matter. If you are in a warmer climate with higher temperatures, typically that's speeding up the degradation of organic matter. So in warmer climates, you're seeing less carbon stored on average. And areas with, for example, higher precipitation, there's typically more plant growth, and therefore more roots and residues are entering the soil in these wetter areas where you see more carbon stored. And then in terms of, sorry about that, flipping back. So in terms of what you can change, this is what we talked about with organic matter additions and making sure you're varying those materials due to their different makeup and C to N ratios. You can also control through management your crop rotation. And this is important because organic matter levels are going to fluctuate during different stages of a crop rotation. So for example, if you have high amounts of root production from hay and pasture crops, you might see higher organic matter levels. And different crops will also have different amounts of residue that you can return to your soil. So if you're harvesting corn for grain, for example, that will leave a lot more residue than if you're taking off the whole plant for silage. Also, if your rotation can include cover crops, you're making sure you're keeping that soil in place and preventing erosion. Last but not least is tillage. Tillage increases decomposition. By tilling, we're aerating the soil and warming it up. So that breaks up macro aggregates, but we're also by tillage using a tool that can help incorporate organic matter so that it's really embedded in your soil profile. And we talked earlier about the physical protection of organic matter that's inside those micro aggregates. Those protected organo-mineral associations are less sensitive to tillage than the micro aggregates that are inside the macro aggregates not physically protected. And lastly, on this part 2, we're going to move on to look more specifically at different farms in different climates and talk about their management strategies. But first want to consider, why do some soils store more carbon than others? So your storage potential or your saturation point, that can be reached earlier depending on your soil type, your climate, and the microbial communities present in your soils. And this is a map here that I created based on data from a source called Soils Revealed. It's a platform that helps visualize past and future management changes to soil organic carbon stocks globally. So this map was created using the grassland and cropland and grassland data sets. And here it's showing the amount of soil organic carbon that can be sequestered within 5 years. And this is assuming you're doing the best management practices that you can. You're cover cropping, adding green manures. And for grasslands, it's assuming that you are also moving to high intensity grazing. So the carbon stocks, again, in this map, they're based on the top 30 centimeters that are going to be largely impacted by your management changes in the short term. Again, we're projecting 5 years, so pretty short term. And you can see there's more potential to store carbon with improved management in the West, which makes sense based on what we saw where in the West there were more degraded soils with less carbon stored. Compared to the Northeast, you see there's less storage potential, but we're at risk also of losing more if we don't continue to build our soil organic matter levels. So we're going to look at 3 farms: Prairie Road Organic Farm in North Dakota, Fresh Air Farms in Ohio, and Homestead Farms in Maryland, all long-term organic farms. And before we delve into that, I just wanted to also quickly review the practices that are going to increase or help to increase your soil organic matter levels. So again, using different types of residues and thinking about your crop rotation. So your crop rotation, again, is very important. We want to be able to incorporate cover crops or perennial grasses to hold soil in place. And we also want to consider crops that may have varying levels of residue. You can also consider adding material that's slightly more lignified and materials that take longer to break down, and considering tillage as a tool as well. So using tillage at certain points in your rotation, we certainly don't want to recreationally till, but it can also, again, be a tool to help incorporate organic matter. Applying manure and grazing are also very applicable strategies as well that we'll discuss in more practical examples. But all of this to say is, there's varying levels of practices, but we do want to find what works for your farm. So we spoke to several different organic grain farmers to see what's worked for them. And I'm going to start with my teammate, Nick Podol, to review the strategy that their family has used on their farm.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Catherine. So yeah, my name's Nick Podol. I'm one of the organic consultants with the Institute here. I'm located in Minnesota, but I grew up on an organic farm in North Dakota. It's been an organic farm since the 1970s. It was first certified in 1977. It's 3/4 sections, so 480 acres. We raise mostly small grains in the grain fields. Soil type is a sandy loam. So in relation to organic matter, because of that sandy component to the soil, our ability to build organic matter is a little bit limited by that, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Just to kind of set the stage of where we're at, to kind of give you an example of our rotation, and our approach to building organic matter in the soil. We use 1 full year of cover cropping, and then 3 years of grain. And so it's sorghum Sudan grass that's planted in June, and it's allowed to go through the full season. Um, and with that, the way we manage that is to mow it off when it gets to be about 30 inches tall, to 3 feet, somewhere in there. Mow it off down to a foot, and then let it regrow again. That way it won't produce seed on us, but it will regrow again to reach heights of 8 or 9 feet sometimes, depending on how much moisture we have. So it's a really good cover crop for um, uh, suppressing weeds. It takes care of problem perennial weeds like Canada thistle very well. It also helps us to kind of manage our fertility. So we put on turkey manure once in the rotation ahead of that sorghum Sudan grass. It uses up that fertility. We want that biomass because of the weed control and those types of things, but also we want to be incorporating as much plant material back into the soil again, sort of like a green manure. And so we apply the fertility once at the top of the rotation, let the sorghum Sudan grass take it up. That all gets worked back into the soil the following spring. And then we go into proso millet. After proso millet harvest in September, triticale and hairy vetch is no-till drilled into that proso millet stubble. And then there's a volunteer cover crop that emerges after the triticale and vetch is harvested the following summer. And then the next spring that is tilled under before we plant buckwheat. So we used to use sweet clover in our rotation. And if you haven't figured it out yet, our approach to building that soil organic matter is really is that full year of cover cropping in the rotation, every so often. So now we're doing it once every 4 years. We used to do it once every 3 years with sweet clover. We quit using sweet clover only because we had sweet clover weevil, and the sweet clover weevils were eating it all to the ground, and so we weren't able to even grow it as a cover crop anymore. But it is one of the best soil builders. I'd recommend it to anybody if they were looking for a longer term cover crop like this. It produces a high biomass, and it's a legume, so it fixes a lot of nitrogen as well. It has a similar effect on perennial weeds as sorghum Sudan grass, because it will also grow 8 feet plus high if you allow it to, but it is a biennial. So most of the time we would undersow it in the grain crop in the previous year, allow it to grow over winter and grow up the entire next season in that field. And then we would work it in August the following year, before we would plant a winter crop. Typically it would be rye or triticale. But the thing that's great about sweet clover is it has those benefits I was talking about with the high biomass and fixing nitrogen, but it also, you can allow it to grow into maturity, into very lignified material, woody material. So it contributes a lot of its biomass to that, right away to that kind of stable pool of organic matter. But it still breaks down very quickly because it has a carbon to nitrogen ratio, even in mature states, that's about that 24-25 to 1 ratio that the microbial community likes to consume. And so it's kind of a best of both worlds, where you don't have nitrogen being immobilized, you're still fixing nitrogen. So there's a lot available to the next crop, but you're also contributing greatly to that stable soil organic matter pool in your soils. So that's really our approach, is those full season covers. Since we've switched to sorghum Sudan grass, we're not building as much organic matter because it's a little less frequency. We're doing once every 4 years a full cover instead of once every 3. And the sorghum Sudan grass doesn't quite have the same effect as the sweet clover does with that highly lignified material. And so since then, the organic matter has been staying relatively steady. I would say before we switched to organic production and we switched to that type of rotation, I know that I would guess that our soil organic matter was down below 3% in that soil, somewhere in the 2s. So not bad, but probably not very, not as high a potential as you could have had. I would say in the last, 40 years or so, we were able to kind of increase that organic matter, and I would say the first 30 years or probably by at least a full percentage point, which is probably about twice as fast as sort of is traditionally said. To gain a full percentage point, there's a lot of claims out there that people make about how quick they can do it. But it really takes a long commitment, and it takes a lot of time, especially in a slightly lighter soil like we have, but still a pretty good soil. It did take a long time to gain a full percentage point. Right now, we're still hovering around that 4% or so, but we're not really gaining ground anymore. And I think we sort of reached the capacity of our soil, at least in a grain system, to continue building there. We do employ some tillage. So part of that reason is because of the tillage and the rotation. We still have to have some of that done. However, we do use it mostly now as a tool to incorporate organic matter, rather than for weed control, which helps to offset any negative impact of tillage. So it's only done 3 times over the course of our rotation. And the first one is to incorporate manure in the spring ahead of that sorghum Sudan grass, so that it has the nutrients it needs. And then again, the following spring to till in that sorghum Sudan grass residue and prepare the seed bed for millet. And then there is no tillage from when millet is planted until the spring just before buckwheat planting, when we incorporate the volunteer triticale hairy vetch cover that was allowed to grow over the winter ahead of that buckwheat. So there's some significant periods of time in the rotation without tillage. And again, we use it as a tool mostly to incorporate organic matter, which helps. So again, the approach is to build that rotation around a full year of cover that allows you to rest and regenerate that soil. And so the way to do that, it's tricky because a lot of farmers need revenue off of their ground every year, but there's a lot of benefits to doing it if you can pull it off. And so you kind of need to make an assessment of how much revenue do you need to make and how many acres is that going to take on your farm. And however many acres you can spare to dedicate to moving to a full season cover and starting your rotation there, you just take a little chunk. And ideally, you're building productivity by incorporating that into your rotation and making your rotation more profitable when it is in a cash crop. And so you can hopefully start to take bigger and bigger chunks moving into that full year cover type rotation as time goes on. And it's been good for our farm. It really has helped to manage the fertility and weeds. It's really elegant for doing that. And it has made the rest of our rotation more profitable without question. And I think that if we were continuing to try to do, cash crops every single year and doing full tillage around that, I don't think that we would have been able to build organic matter and sustain it at the level that we have. So, yeah, that's about it for our farm. So.
Thanks, Nick. I think that's a really important point, which we didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about in this webinar, but just the sort of not so much to your point about mystery in terms of building or soil organic matter, but certainly more challenging to do when you're thinking from a financial perspective of the
Nick,
amount of time it takes.
Sorry, Nick, there were two questions for you before we move on to other farms. Catherine, I don't know, sorry if I interrupted you.
Oh, no, that's great.
So one of them was, could you use a mix of cover crops instead of just a single species?
You certainly could use a mix if you wanted to. And actually, I should say that we do use a mix with the sorghum Sudan grass. We often will put cowpeas and forage soybean in there as well to provide a little bit of nitrogen fixation and kind of fill in any gaps, especially the cowpeas really help as they kind of vine, and the forage soybeans kind of act a little bit similarly in that way too. And they will fill any spaces where maybe the sorghum Sudan grass didn't take as much or something like that if you have a little variability. But generally we have a pretty good stand of sorghum Sudan grass, but we do have those legumes underneath there typically.
Thank you. And the other question is there any cover on the soil after the grain is harvested during the 3 grain years?
Yes, there always is. In the after the sorghum Sudan grass is planted, we go to proso millet. Immediately after the millet is harvested, the triticale vetch is planted, and it overwinters into the next year. So we have a cover over the winter there after the millet. After the triticale vetch, there's quite a bit of seed that lighter seed that goes through the combine and goes on the ground. And it most of the time we just allow volunteer cover to come up. If we need to seed something else in there because the volunteer cover stand is thin, we will do that if we have to. But if you can have a good thick stand of volunteer triticale and vetch that again overwinters without having to seed it, that's pretty nice. Saves you quite a bit of money trying to go over the field again. So and then after that we have buckwheat. After the buckwheat is harvested, we do put in a cover again before we go back around the rotation in the spring. Oftentimes, most often nowadays, as climate change has affected things, we have later and later frosts. Most of the time we would get a frost at the farm in North Dakota by early September, but it hasn't been that way. We've been getting frosts well into October quite often now. And so after buckwheat harvest, again, we have a lot of times we have a good volunteer stand of buckwheat that comes up, and it winter kills as soon as we have a hard frost. But it does, it usually gets, buckwheat grows really fast, and it usually provides a decent cover on the soil over the winter before we go back around in that rotation and put manure down and plant sorghum Sudan grass again. So there's always a cover on the fields during the winter. Yes.
Thanks, Nick. That was it. Carry on, Catherine.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Nick. Thanks, Leah. I'm hearing an echo, so hopefully you can all still hear me.
Yep, all good.
Okay. All right. Thank you again. We're going to look at 2 other farms in the time we have left. So Fresh Air Farms, this is on the map, the farm on the western border of Ohio. And just as Nick spoke to the importance of cover crops, Fresh Air Farms with farmer Dan Young, and he has focused largely on livestock integration as his soil organic matter builder. So Dan's based in Union City, Ohio. They have about 200 to 300 acres and have been organic since 1992. Their soil type is a silt loam, so I'd say probably slightly better in terms of your building organic matter. And their rotation is corn to sunflower to wheat or another cereal, and then spelt. And again, the unique piece of Dan's story here is that they have cattle, so about 130 head. So they'll also have clover or alfalfa and grass for grazing. And really the key management strategy for Dan has been his sort of own version of bale grazing. So he will typically, or starting many years ago, started putting out the feeders, about an 8-foot round feeder on his poorer clay grounds and move them daily. So the cattle would follow the feeder. He's seen less waste using these ring feeders versus unrolling the bales, given their, more wetter and variable winters. And the result was, a really important soil builder. They had about 2-inch layers of waste from the hay and the manure and the urine, all coming from the cattle surrounding the feeder that was moving daily. And Dan really said that was a huge improvement to the tilth of their land. Plus, you have many winters of that organic matter addition that they leave in the field until about May, and it breaks down from the soil biology. So this is, takes a great deal of management and experience, and it's pretty unique, at least for us, to work with grain farms that have cattle, but it certainly benefited his operation. All the fields coming from a 2 to 3% organic matter level are now in the 4% range. So not sure if Dan is on, but he could definitely speak to any points of this if people have questions, but did want to sort of highlight a more unique way to build your organic matter through Dan's farm. And then last but not least is Homestead Farms in Maryland. Their strategy involves both cover crops and tillage, similar to Nick's family's farm. And so these are the Howards. They're in Millington, Maryland. They've got about 850 acres. They've been organic since 2015. Sandy loam, so a little more challenging to build your organic matter. They're on the eastern shore of Maryland. And their rotation is, they're working towards a 2-year rotation with 4 crops. So corn to winter wheat to soybean and cover crop. So on the right here, you can see a photo of this crimson and wheat cover that was flown on in early October, post the double crop beans, and had a really beautiful stand. You can see this other photo on the bottom right. And to also mention tillage, we'll focus on tillage for the most intensive crops. So pre-corn planting, this cover was moldboarded into the ground. They then disked and applied manure and disked again to incorporate that manure. And then post-corn planting, some mechanical weed control, which is pretty much essential for weed control and organic grain systems. So a note on the plow, they reintroduced that about 5 years ago. And in this field specifically, that's highlighted below here where this cover was, organic matter levels have stayed steady. So in 2016, they're around 2.2%, have held steady until 2018 to 2023, where they've been about 2.3%. So this is, I'd say, a very extremely impressive feat for an intensive grain operation that's double cropping. And in general, in a cash grain operation, about, reading this quote here, 55 to 60% of the above ground plant biomass is harvested as grain and sold off the farm, thereby returning less than half of the mass of the above ground plant to the soil. So again, it takes a great deal of management and commitment to sort of add that mass and that biomass, I should say, back to the soil and keep your organic matter levels steady. And they've been able to do so by, again, varying additions, cover cropping, and manure, and then using tillage as a tool to incorporate those additions. So various examples, it's more typical rotation, you'll see corn, soybean, wheat, but glad we're able to sort of highlight different areas and different crops and rotations. And then with that, I just wanted to say thank you for your participation. Here's my contact information. If you have any specific questions, again, my name is Catherine. I'm a Pennsylvania organic consultant, and this is a link to our website that highlights our whole consulting team and the services that we provide. So we have, looks like, some time left for questions if there are any. And again, that's my email and phone number. If you have any more specific questions or interested in our team services.
Thanks, Catherine. There is no more question in the Q&A box or in the chats, but we can put a couple minutes if any pop in and
sure.
None arrive. Oh, here is one. Are there any books or materials that help compose cover crop rotation?
There is a source called, let's say, I'm blanking on the name now. It's a similar SARE publication as the book I was referencing, Building Soils for Better Crops. I think it's just called Organic Crop Rotations. I wish there were more sources on this, but it is something, you know, building your crop rotation is so specific to your location and what markets are accessible given where you are. But that book does provide a wealth of information. So if you want to email me, oh, I see. Follow up. How to combine different cash crops with different cover crops. Yeah. I think that goes back to, Nick's slide here. I would certainly spend some time thinking about these questions. You know, they've been able to build up to a full year of cover cropping. But firstly, considering how much revenue you need to make and how many acres it will take is really important to first understand. And then building in, you know, piece by piece, however many acres you can spare to dedicate to that full season cover. Leah, I see you typing if you want to also add.
Yeah, I just added, like, there is actually a good SARE publication, which is called Crop Rotation on Organic Farms, that I think touches on crops and cover crop together. I just put the link there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is probably the best resource that I've seen that would speak to that question.
Well, seeing no more questions coming in, I guess maybe we can give everyone back 5 minutes of their time today and thank Catherine.
Yeah, thank you all so much for joining. And yeah, again, feel free to reach out to our team.
Another question. I grow small grains and beans in central Missouri with low tillage practice, but have growing infestation with Johnson grass. Any tip?
Let's see. Central Missouri float. Yeah.
Nick, do you have something on Johnson grass?
I can weigh in here. I would say You know, the low tillage practices are gonna be, you know, a little bit difficult, I think, to get rid of that Johnson grass. There's those, they have those big roots underneath the soil, and about the best way that I know how to get rid of those, and you know, the no-till guys and low tillage folks are not gonna like the answer very much, but the best way to do it is to moldboard plow it and flip those roots up in the winter time so that they're exposed to the winter air. And it's not something that you want to get to be doing very often, of course, because you want to have cover over the winter. But at the same time, if you need to get rid of an infestation like that, that's a sure way, a more sure way to do it. Another way to do it, I think, would be to have a cover crop that's growing during the same season as the Johnson grass, so that you can suppress it and exhaust those root reserves. And I'm not sure how long that would take. I think it would take a number of years, going through the rotation a few times probably to accomplish it, but you know, a full season cover like a sorghum Sudan grass or something would help significantly to reduce your amount of the concentration of the Johnson grass. So
Yeah, I was gonna say the same about the sorghum Sudan grass. I'm putting in the chat a video with one of our organic advisor talking about using sorghum Sudan grass to fight Canada thistle. So I think it would be a similar problem and similar method where you're trying to compete against the Johnson grass below and above ground. And yeah, it would be probably a similar approach with a combination of tillage and the sorghum Sudan grass. So if you want to watch that video and maybe try to use that method against the Johnson grass. All right, well, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks Catherine for your presentation. Thanks Nick as well for your contribution. I hope everybody learned something today.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining. And again, feel free to reach out to us.